Good afternoon all again. I think it's time to start. Everybody has put off the cameras and put themselves on mute, which is excellent. Please also note you will be recorded. My name is Christophe Boulanger of Infinigate, your added value distributor or driving the business for NETSCOUT. And on the floor today is Richard Hummel to give you insights on DDoS protection. Richard, the floor is yours. Just unmute yourself and we'll be all set.
Yeah, I use the web version of Microsoft Teams, so it double mutes me. So
right.
I'll remember that.
Excellent.
Thanks, Christophe, and thanks for having me, everyone. So we have quite a bit of content to cover today, but I would like to implore you guys, if you have questions along the way, you can pipe them into the chat channel. I know I've got one of my guys listening, and then Christophe, I'm sure, is monitoring. Feel free to interrupt me if at any time. There's a lot of content and there's a lot of topic changes. So if there's a question that comes on a particular topic and we want to address it before we move forward, perfectly happy to do that. You will not disrupt my flow whatsoever. So please feel free to interrupt and raise those questions early and often if you have them. Okay, so I'm going to start with a PowerPoint presentation. There was a specific ask for me on this, and that is to bring it home. How does it relate to your particular geographic area? So what I want to do is I'm going to walk you through the global insights that we have, touching a little bit on regional and country. But then I want to pivot over to an actual analysis backend that I have access to show you specifically how DDoS hacktivists are coming after your particular countries and your particular websites. And so I'm going to do both of these things. So let's start with the PowerPoint. I'm going to share this, and then we will get moving. And let me navigate through all of the nuances of Microsoft Teams. You know, being half of our company uses Microsoft Teams, I should be more familiar with it, but I am not, unfortunately. Okay, I think you guys should see my presentation. If not, just stop me, but I think we're good. Let's see, let's do this. Let me just get the WebEx. Okay, I'm gonna get both screens up here so I can make sure that I can see anything that comes in. So just give me a second to rearrange my windows here. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about as we get into this topic of the DDoS threat landscape is, how can you trust me? How can you know that what I'm telling you is legitimate? How do I know what hacktivists are doing and what DDoS adversaries are launching out there? And so really what I want to do up front is just give you the breadth and scope of the visibility that we have into this problem. When we talk about DDoS attacks, we're not talking about an isolated segment. We're not talking about a specific industry, specific surface, say websites, or just servers, or just enterprises. We're talking about a global perspective here. We have been building this telemetry for 3 decades. And we have been working with service providers and enterprises around the globe, as well as our research team, to deploy things out all over the place where we do have a very, very comprehensive global perspective. So when I look at all of the coverage that we have, we're talking about if there's a DDoS attack that trips an alarm, a threshold, in 3/4 of the world's addressable internet space, we're going to see it. So if you look at all IP address space, roughly 70 to 75% of all address space is announced globally. There's always like a 25%, 30%. That's kind of a reserve space that isn't addressable or routable at any given time. So there's never like a 100% of the internet is always routable, always addressable. It's typically 3/4. Of that 3/4, we see attacks in about 3/4 of that space. So that gives you the scope. That equates to about 550 to 600 terabits per second of telemetry in which we can observe DDoS attack characteristics. Now, we're not collecting that data. We're not getting PCAPs or flow or anything like that. In fact, that'd be way too much data. I would not want to pay for that. What we're getting is insights on that. We're getting a little bit of metadata. We're understanding the source IP addresses of where the attacks are coming from. We're understanding what attack vectors and methodology. What are the sizes of those attacks? That's the kind of telemetry that I care about. Because what I want to do is classify what the adversary is doing. what they're launching, what kind of attack vectors, who they're going after in terms of geography. Now, we never actually see the end victim because we have anonymized data to protect our customers, GDPR, PII, all of that stuff. And so we typically anonymize everything. And when we get the data, all I care about is the adversary side. I want to understand what the adversary is doing. Now, to the extent that I want to understand what the adversary is targeting, we will do things like geographic enrichment, such as what country or what industry something might fall into, but never individuals. All of that telemetry comes from all of our customers. In fact, our customers are our biggest contribution of anonymous statistics to us that allows us to track these adversaries around the globe. And so each one of our customers makes a decision to participate in our data sharing program. As a result of that, we have more than 500 service providers. This is 9 of 10 tier 1s. This is 80 to 90% of tier 2s, many tier 3s. This is almost every single one of our enterprises are contributing to this global telemetry in order for us to get characterization about what DDoS attack adversaries are doing. And so more than 500 service providers, more than 2,000 enterprise sites. And then we also have our own homegrown honeypot system that's deployed globally. We also subscribe to others that run their own honeypots, and we share data back and forth. And so collectively, there's more than 8,000 honeypot nodes distributed all around the world, including in countries that are typically very difficult to get into. And so we have a very good insight into what's happening around the globe in terms of DDoS. More than 100 countries. I think that the number is somewhere around 118 different countries in which we're gathering this DDoS attack telemetry for us to characterize and classify attack traffic. So this is the scale. This is the scope at which we see. And there's been several studies done. More recently, some of my guys were participating in an academic paper. And part of that paper was to take academic insights as well as network telescope projects. I won't get into what those are. You can go look them up yourself. But network telescopes keep track of a lot of state on the internet. And then the academics are basically looking at those telescopes to figure out, okay, what is the total number of DDoS attacks? What are these really large attacks? How can we track these? How can we trace these? And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to work with commercial entities to figure out, okay, of all the commercial vendors out there that track this from a global perspective, who has the most amount of data and how much of that data can help us infer or validate the attacks that we're claiming. And so when we did this with a bunch of peers. And if you go look at this paper, you can actually see all of the peers that we worked with on this. And NETSCOUT was about 100 times more likely to validate a finding from academic in terms of DDoS attacks than any other of our competitors. And that is because we sit where the attacks are. Now, let me just kind of break this down for you. If we were a DDoS vendor and we were only caring about websites, or we only cared about the tip top of the enterprise, or we only cared about a particular telecom sector, you would only be seeing slivers. You would be very biased based on that. Now, you might have very broad, very good coverage in terms of global phenomena, but again, you're still going to have that insight of we're very biased in what we're collecting. We don't have that. In fact, the vast majority of DDoS attacks today, they take place inside broadband access networks. They're launched from them and they're destined to them. And so if you're not sitting in that service provider telemetry space collecting attack traffic, you miss out on that. You miss out on 80 to 90% of all DDoS attacks. That's where NETSCOUT plays. We play in that service provider space. So we're able to be able to see a lot of these attacks that would otherwise go completely unnoticed from many of the peers that share this space with us. So that's where this is coming from. So as we go through these stats, as we go through the different sections, keep that in mind. We're looking at this from that global footprint and being able to tell you all of these things. And what I'm going to show you here is only part of the story. If you really want to dig in deep, if you want to play around with some of these graphs, they're all interactive on our website, netscout.com/startreport. There's way more resources on here than I'm going to talk about today. So what I'm going to talk about is these three categories: threats, targets, and defense. However, we also have a global analysis page. We have a regional analysis page. We have 160 country pages. And each one of those is going to drill further and further down into specific industries and segments. And so definitely use that. We have a page that talks about the DDoS attack vectors, a periodic table that shows you all of the vectors, the number of devices that are abusable on the net, the number of attacks we saw for each of these things. We have a botnet page that talks about the number of bot nodes on the internet and what we're seeing in terms of attacks against enterprise and service provider. So there's a ton more resources on the website that you're not going to get today. So I definitely implore you guys to go and look at that. Okay, so this is the agenda. Again, like I said, it's pretty loose. I'm happy to pause at any time and circle back around to answer questions. So please ask them as they come. There's two things that I want you to take away from this. If you remember nothing else of what I say, two very, very simple takeaways. The first one being DDoS attacks are skyrocketing. The number of attacks, the number of multi-vector attacks, the size of attacks, the complexity of attacks, everything is literally just through the roof. And you're going to see actually coming up in a slide that the whole slide is red. Red meaning that they're increasing. We don't want them to increase. Red is bad, right? I mean, stop. We don't want that. There's one line that is green. And I'm going to show you that green line is kind of a misnomer. It's a bit of a false canary, and I'll explain why that is in a second. But by and large, every single attack vector methodology type is up and to the right. And the main reason for that, which is the title of this presentation, is hacktivism, an era of DDoS hacktivism. That is why we're seeing a massive increases here in DDoS attacks, and I'll explain that as we go through. So DDoS attacks exploded, and DDoS attacks hurt. And so you might be an organization, you might be a service provider that says, you know what, yeah, there's DDoS attacks, but it doesn't really hurt us that much. Well, I'm hoping here that I will disprove that. Maybe they don't impact you, but chances are they impact somebody either along the way or downstream from you. And there's a lot of thought going into this right now in terms of features and things that we're working on, as well as more and more enterprises saying that we can't rely on our upstream. We can't rely on cloud providers because by then it's too late. By then we've been impacted. And we're tired of these intermittent latency issues. We're tired of maybe sporadic outages or users saying, I couldn't resolve to your website for a few minutes. All of these go hand in hand with this DDoS space. And it's no longer the case where, well, it might hurt, or I can weather it for a time, or you know what, DDoS attacks don't really cause a lot of damage. That is no longer true. And don't just take my word for it. You can take NISA. So the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity puts out a report every single year. They, for the longest time, every single year, have had ransomware as their #1 threat. Now, the way that NISA does their rankings is they rank based on incidents. So when I think incidents, and I think this is where NISA goes with this, having worked in APT and cybercrime and now DDoS, when they talk about an incident, they're talking about something specifically that causes damage, that causes harm, that causes brand reputation damage, that causes significant revenue loss, that requires a concerted collective response to something to remediate another thing, okay? So ransomware is an obvious one. Somebody gets ransomware deployed, maybe they stole your files. This requires all hands on deck. You have to try to figure out how you're gonna mitigate the damages, how you're going to recover. Did you isolate? Did you segment your networks? Are you gonna pay the ransomware, which I don't encourage? Are you going to engage with law enforcement? Like, this is a full-on incident. DDoS attacks never really bubbled up to that top spot because oftentimes people would be like, it's just DDoS. It's not really hurting anything. That has changed. NISA now ranks DDoS as the #1 threat in terms of incidents that they saw over the past year. DDoS attacks hurt. They're taking down websites, they're taking down services, they're causing disruptions for enterprises, businesses, service providers, downstream consumers, and it's being noticed. And so DDoS attacks absolutely hurt. Now, I told you there was going to be mostly red on one slide with one line of green. So every region and globally, we have seen an increase in attacks. The exception during the first half of 2024 was Asia Pacific region. However, we literally published this, and 2 weeks after we published this, DDoS hacktivists turned their attention to Japan. and they launched an all-out blitz on various websites in Japan, and that little bit of decrease in attacks was quickly erased. And so that's just because we were looking at a 6-month segment. If I were to expand this to 7 months, every single thing here would be in the red. And so that's why I say it was a little bit of a misnomer, because literally every single region right now is up in terms of the number of DDoS attacks. Now, where most of this is occurring is in the European region. Now, there's a lot of contributing factors here. There's the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. There's the Iran-Israel conflict. There's conflict around Syria. There's always constant conflict around various elections. You have all of the European elections that took place. You have the French elections that took place. You have the Olympics that went on during this time period. All of this stuff is contributing factors to DDoS hacktivists saying, we don't agree with your ideology. We don't agree with your religious stance. We don't agree with your immigration stance. You made this comment against Russia, or you made this comment in support of Ukraine. That is all it takes to come under assault by one of these organizations. And so no matter where you're going, where you're looking at these things, that needs to be front and center of your mind. Let me give you an example. What we saw probably 5-6 months ago now, I was doing some analysis and I started to see spikes in DDoS attacks against South Korea. Now, South Korea always gets a large number of DDoS attacks. There's whatever reason, there's a lot of people that don't like South Korea, and so they're always getting floods of DDoS attacks. But I was noticing a significant uptick in the number of application layer attacks. So these are layer 7 going after websites, going after particular services. And I was seeing a pretty significant uptick, but there was no chatter. There was no underground activity. There was no Telegram messaging. There was no media articles. I could not figure out why they were getting a flood of attacks. Typically, when I see a significant spike of that nature, there's usually some accompanying reason behind it. So I kept watching it. A few hours go by, and finally I see something. And what I saw was an X thread where Ambassador Wong from South Korea was talking to United Nations, something like 57 member delegates, basically bashing North Korea because they were basically causing all of this heartache and hardship around the demarcation zone between North and South Korea. There's a lot of refugees, there was poverty, there was sickness, there was health issues. And so basically the Ambassador Wong was saying, hey, we need help. We need you guys to come in and help us here because North Korea is not helping the situation at all. Well, somebody didn't like that. And so they were launching attacks against them. And the reason why I know for sure that that is the reason is because the very next day, Ambassador Wong went to Romania. And he was talking to the Romanian government about providing missile defense systems to protect them against Russia. Well, guess what happened? The DDoS attacks followed Ambassador Wong to Romania. And so the adversary is paying attention to this. They know what's happening in the geopolitical space. They are following politics. They are following religious conversations. They are following conflicts very closely. And they are absolutely keying in their targeting based on these public perceptions. So if you're working with anyone, any enterprise, any business, any government, service provider who is playing at that level, just know that if you make public statements, those statements are going to come under scrutiny by the adversary and likely paint a target on your back. And so just be very cognizant of that, whether you make them yourself or you're securing a network of, say, somebody that would make those. It doesn't matter that you didn't say them particularly. They're going to go after the website or the properties of whoever did say it. And so if you're responsible for protecting those, you need to know that you're going to come under assault. Now we have solutions. We have a bunch of blogs out there. We have security advisories. We have various countermeasures. We have threat intelligence content, all geared at combating these adversaries. And so we have plenty of recourse. In fact, if you look at public claims to fame for these guys, and you start to look at patterns, you'll see almost zero claim of credit of taking down a website in which NETSCOUT products are deployed because they don't succeed, because we know their tactics, we know their methods, and we can tune our countermeasures appropriately. And we're actually going to get to some of the Belgium stuff that happened during the election cycle in Belgium. And I'm going to show you that when we actually get to sharing kind of the back end stuff. But that's a really good example of if you're secured, if you're prepared and you've planned ahead, you will be okay. But the key here is that preparation and planning. So all of this driven by geopolitical hacktivism. So let's dig into a little bit of this. Where are the attacks coming from? They're coming largely now from more botnets. It used to be that most of the attacks out there were volumetric in nature. So they're using devices that can reflect or amplify traffic back to somebody of their choosing. That still happens at scale, but what we're seeing more and more is botnets being leveraged to launch these attacks. Botnets are harder to detect. They often create connections that look like legitimate users. They can typically launch more sophisticated attack types. They tend to be a little bit more resilient because they can move them around. They can deploy their own code. So there's a lot of benefits to adversaries using botnets. And they also want to make sure that those botnets are not disrupted. And so one of the things that we're seeing lately is that more and more adversaries are choosing to deploy and or compromise devices in what we would call a bulletproof hosting provider or a nuisance network. That is a network that typically does not police their users. They let them do whatever they want. They can spin up command and control infrastructure. They can do high profile scanning. They can do reconnaissance. They can do exploitation. They can send out spam campaigns. Basically, their users can do whatever they want, and they just kind of turn a blind eye. Now, they'll tell you that they're completely legal, they're above board, but then when law enforcement comes in and say, hey, this thing's doing bad things, they're like, oh, that's actually a subsidy over there, and we've sent them notifications, but they don't actually do anything about it. And so the adversary is basically able to run unchecked on a lot of these networks. We started to see this weird convergence where every now and then we would see one of these things show up, but then as time went on, we started to see every single time there's a bulletproof hosting provider, there's almost always another one. And so if you actually add all of these up, we're talking about 65% of the time when there is one of these networks, there's another. And 26% of the time, there's 4 or more of these things. And so there's this convergence of adversaries choosing to run their attack infrastructure from these highly resilient networks that are not listening to law enforcement or takedown attempts, which means they don't go anywhere. So as a result of this, one of the things that we did is we created content in our Atlas intelligence feed to solve this problem. So we have 2 different ways. One, we have a bulletproof hosting content in AIF that basically says, we know these are bad. They're absolutely bad. They're doing lots of really, really bad activity. We can say for certain that these are bulletproof hosting providers. And then the next one is nuisance networks. So while some of the customers of these or some of the segments of the nuisance networks will do bad things, there's also some legitimate things hosted here. And so we won't blanket say you must block these all the time, but we will still publish that content so that when you are under a DDoS attack, or if you have zero tolerance for any even relation to these things, you can then block those. And so we understand that this is something that's happening. We have then generated intelligence content to solve this problem specifically. Then you have botnet proliferation. Now, something that's pretty interesting to me is botnets are increasing at an alarming rate against the enterprise. Now, that's not to say that they're not going after service providers. They are. But by and large, most of the DDoS attacks that we're seeing are against enterprise. And I think I've got another slide coming up that's going to show you that. But the number of nodes are increasing with APAC as the nexus for most of these things. So APAC, most of the botnets that we're seeing kind of come online right now are going to be in Vietnam, in Thailand, and China. These are the 3 main countries of origin for a lot of these botnets. And they're going to be things like MikroTik routers or DVRs and CCTV cameras. And that's typically where the adversary is going, because these devices have multiple vulnerabilities. There's multiple open source exploit code that they can deploy and try to compromise these things. And what we have seen is this weird space where a lot of the command control is also used to launch DDoS attacks. Now, there used to be a very fine separation between these because you don't want to compromise your command and control. So you would have a few nodes here and there for all of my bots are going to check into these nodes, but those nodes are never going to actually launch an attack because they need to be passive, right? They just need to sit there and collect data from my victims. They need to orchestrate the attacks. I don't want to launch an attack because then I might end up on a block list. And then my bots can't check in anymore. Well, I think what's happening here is that because a lot of these bot threats out there are fully automated, you're finding that more and more of these nodes are dual compromised. They might have 2 or more different botnet codes running at any given time, and one bot operator might use it as an attacking node, another might use it as command and control. And they don't necessarily know that each other are there because this whole process is automated. And so now you actually have 63% of the command and control nodes out there actually being used to launch DDoS attacks. Now, this is a benefit to us because if you're in the enterprise and you're using our threat intelligence content, you now have a way to block both. So you can block the inbound from DDoS attacks, but you can also block the outbound command and control. And so if you have downstream users, if you have a large enterprise base, and maybe you suspect that there might be some potential for compromises downstream, now you can block the outbound. And so even if they are compromised, they can't communicate to the command and control server, and then therefore can't be complicit in launching attacks. And so all of this is going hand in hand with these things. And so this is, again, the explosion in the changes in infrastructure that is being used across the board. Now, DDoS is the #1 botnet out there right now. Now, I say #1 in terms of the number of attacks. Is it the largest? Probably not. Is it the most impactful? That's debatable. But it is being used by NoName57. Now, what's really intriguing about this, the DDoS infrastructure, it's not owned by the adversary. It's not operated by the adversary. In fact, the entire infrastructure is based on the premise of a game. And so what NoName57 did is they basically said, we are going to pay anyone with our own custom digital currency if you can spin up infrastructure and deploy your DDoS botnet code on that infrastructure. And you're going to get paid based on how long you maintain your presence, how many attacks we can launch from it, and what the impact of those attacks are. And so now NoName57 has weaponized the entire criminal underground. Anyone that wants to earn this custom digital currency just has to spin up a node somewhere. So what has this enabled? Now you have a bunch of criminals out there, or would-be criminals or opportunists, or whatever you want to call them, intent on finding infrastructure that is very resilient. So they will go to bulletproof hosting providers. They will go to nuisance networks. They will actually do free accounts on public cloud hosting providers. So think Google, Akamai Linode, Azure, all of these different public cloud hosting providers where you can spin up accounts and do trials, or you can get really, really cheap access to various nodes. They will spin these things up. They would deploy their DDoS code, giving NoName57 access to all of these nodes everywhere. And then they in turn will go and launch application layer attacks. And then those criminals that are operating these things are completely divorced from the activity. In fact, they actually have plausible deniability, right? They're not doing anything bad. They're just hosting infrastructure. And somebody else somewhere did something else on it, right? And so this is a problem, because how do you take down a disparate distributed network like that, where you might have tens of thousands of individual users hosting one tiny little segment of the DDoS bot code? Very, very difficult, very hard proposition to get around. So we have to look at it from, well, what do those attacks look like? What are the characteristics of those? What vectors are they using? What attack targets are they going after? Then we start to create countermeasures. We start to create threat intelligence content to solve this problem. Because I don't think we're going to solve this problem truly by going after the operators of this infrastructure. I just don't think we can. And this group particularly has a very, very strong Russian nexus tie. So there's probably a super high probability we would never actually get to the authors of this. We would never get to the core of the no-name group. So how do you take down this thing? Well, you probably don't. So now you've got to figure out, how do I counter this? And that's where we're at, is how do you counter this? And so we actually track their campaigns. So we have threat intelligence based on their campaigns. We track the DDoS bot code itself. So we have the botnet on record. I think we're tracking roughly 30,000 nodes at any given time for the DDoS bot infrastructure, as well as their individual campaigns. And so we have pretty good coverage from a threat intelligence point, but we also know exactly what kind of attack vectors. You can see right there. We know exactly the combination. We know if it's a HTTP GET post, or if it's a flood, if it's a TCP SYN ACK flood. We know what ports they're going after. So we have all of this. And internally, we have created regexes. We've created user agent regex, where we can actually counter the stuff specifically and surgically stop a lot of the no-name activity. And so this is where we have to do the countermeasures and where we have to defeat some of these groups because they are getting more sophisticated, making it much harder to do takedowns and to stop them with one simple swoop. Now, this group itself is very, very prolific and active. I would say if I had to look at the entire DDoS history and I had to look at any hacktivist group ever active, these guys are pretty close to the top, if not the top, in terms of the amount of activity, the amount of damage they've caused, their propaganda, their complexity, the sophistication of the group. I mean, these guys rank up there. Now, I put these statistics across the top. In this time period, 150,000 attacks. This is the first half of 2024. But they only claimed credit for taking down 2,000. In fact, it was actually only 1,500 websites, and several of those claimed multiple times for takedown. But they launched 150,000 attacks to get there. So the moral of this story is that what you see publicly, claims on Telegram, claims on X, claims on whatever instant messaging platform is out there, or social media, is typically the tip of the iceberg, right? The public claim to fame for these guys is just the very tip top. They're launching way more on the back end in order to effectuate those takedowns. And so it could be they're just hammering and hammering and hammering, and they get lucky that maybe there was another flood of traffic coming in somewhere else. So during one of their attacks, they were able to take it down. They will absolutely capitalize on those to say, look what we did, we succeeded. Now, whether it was them or not is irrelevant, because at that point, now they start to erode at the brand. They start to erode at public trust in that website being able to stay up and the security of that company. And so that's what these guys are trying to do. They're trying to cause all of this damage from a reputation point of view, from a propaganda point of view. They're not in it for the money. In fact, I believe this group is funded, which is contrary to most hacktivist groups out there. Because if they're offering their own resources to people operating their infrastructure, where are they getting their money? They don't do DDoS extortion. They don't ask for Bitcoin payments. So they are absolutely being funded. Now, when I look at the activity of this group, you can actually see on this graph in May, May was huge. In fact, we have not seen another month like May in all of the time that these guys have been operating. Now, what's significant about May? That was a massive campaign against the German police force. They went hard at them for weeks and just hundreds and hundreds of attacks against these things. And so it was a very much personal thing for these guys to go after the German police. We have seen similar campaigns against Belgium during the election period. We've seen similar things against South Korea for a short amount of time. Romania, Poland, Sweden, Ukraine, you see these pockets of activity. But none of those actually got to the same level or threshold of what we saw against the German police, which is pretty interesting. Somebody in the no-name group really did not like what the German police were doing during that time period, and as a result, just hammered them hard. I'm going to show you some of the websites that were targeted in a little bit. Okay, so all of the infrastructure. Now the key is, how do we understand this from the origination of the attack to the end of the attack? And so we track these things across the board. Now I'm gonna share with you guys a statistic that I find kind of, it hurts a little bit, because I'm in security, I'm in defense. I understand that we need to do this collectively. We need to work together to solve this problem. And so when I see a statistic about like what I'm about to share with you guys, it kind of hurts a little bit, because it's like, well, what are we doing? What are we doing as a community to solve this problem? Last year, we published a statistic that said less than 1% of any organization anywhere cared about outbound DDoS attacks. Less than 1%. Now, they might know that there's outbound DDoS attacks, but they're doing nothing about it. Absolutely nothing. So when I look at this, and I see that this is a 400 gigabit per second attack targeted at one organization, but 20 other service providers along the way detected the outbound attack and did nothing about it, that scares me a little bit. Because as organizations, as enterprises, as service providers, we are just letting the adversary run completely unchecked. We are letting them use our resources. We are letting them use our downstream subscribers, compromised devices in our networks to basically run amok on the internet. And we're not doing anything to suppress that outbound traffic. And this is happening globally everywhere. And so to me, this is something that needs to be very near and dear to us as DDoS defenders in this space. We have to figure out what is the better way to solve this problem. If any one of the 20 service providers in the cases of some of these things had negated some of that outbound traffic, chances are the downstream wouldn't have had an impact at all, or would have been significantly less. So we're talking tens of gigabits per second of traffic being scrubbed because one service provider says, I'm not going to let outbound traffic impact the environment. Now, what if we had half of those? Well, now that attack is run of the mill. Now, almost any DDoS defensive solution out there would have solved that problem. But nobody did anything, which means a 400 gigabit per second attack slams into the victim. And if they don't have proper preparation, if they don't have capacity, they're now offline. And so this is something that we have to get better about. We have to be cognizant of the fact that these attacks are not just hurting one person. It's not just your organization that's impacted. It's every single thing along the way. And so if we can get better about stopping some of this outbound traffic, we should absolutely do that. And it's not any one particular segment that needs to worry about this. It's everything. Government, nonprofit, enterprise, whether it's cable, wired, wireless, satellite, doesn't matter. Everyone has to worry about DDoS attacks, because when DDoS attacks come, it's not just going to be a small amount. When you become the target of any of these things, when you're under peak DDoS load, we're talking between 40 and 300 gigabits per second of DDoS attack traffic. Now, I know many enterprises don't even have 40 gigs. They have a 20 gig link into their enterprise. So what happens when that link is saturated? It just stops. There's nothing. Nothing comes into your edge. So how do you handle that? Well, the first thing is you've got to be able to handle that first 20 gigs for sure. And then anything that exceeds, you need to have a backup. You need to have a hybrid solution. You need to be working with a cloud vendor. You need to be working with a service provider, because these attacks are happening, and they're happening at scales that need to have a joint hybrid solution. Service providers, 1 terabit per second or greater attacks, it's commonplace now. This is almost a daily occurrence for having attacks that exceed a terabit. We're currently working on researching a botnet right now that can launch 2 billion packets per second. It's gigapackets per second. That's huge. What network out there can handle 2 gigapackets per second? Not very many. Maybe some of the really, really large CDNs where they can take the traffic and saturate it across their entire CDN edge. But most organizations would absolutely tip over getting a 2 gigapacket per second attack. And so we need to be aware of this. We need to understand what is our capacity here. Obviously, you have to do some risk assessment that says, hey, if we go beyond this capacity, we can't afford that. And so we have to accept that this is going to be our maximum capacity that we can then mitigate. If it exceeds that, we have to be willing to say, okay, we're going to go down for a period of time. Or we need to go to a cloud vendor. We need to go to an upstream and say, hey, we want to have you on backup in case something happens. And have that as a last resort. Have it as a backup. And if you're an enterprise, you absolutely need to make sure that you have these as backup, because the time will come when your network pipes are saturated. And at that point in time, you don't even know if it's a DDoS attack because there's no traffic coming in. It's just done. And I know this from experience. We actually operate our own infrastructure for our research team. And last year we came under scrutiny by an adversary who didn't like what we were doing. And they started to launch 30 and 40 gigabit per second attacks against us. Well, we only have a 20 gig pipe. And so our network just started cutting off intermittently. And at first we didn't even know what was going on because the attacks were larger and we weren't seeing any smaller attacks. And so it wasn't until we engaged with Arbor Cloud where we started to do redirection using GRE tunneling. And they're like, oh yeah, you guys are getting like 34 gigabit per second attacks and it's just saturating your entire pipe. And so nothing's coming in. And so now we have that always on, where if we get anything larger than 20 gigs, then it defaults over to our cloud and they just mitigate it and then pass the clean traffic back to us. And so this is what happens pretty frequently around the world. And it's all due to the hacktivists. I mean, all of this surge right now, that's not to say normal attacks aren't there. That's not to say gamers and kids and teenagers still aren't launching attacks. It's still like the vast majority of things. But all of the surges, the significant increases, the trends that we're seeing right now, almost exclusively, we can lay that at the feet of DDoS hacktivists. No Name in particular is the predominant one here. And so you look at the right-hand side here. Excuse me. Let me get a drink here. Had another hour and a half presentation just before this one, so my voice is starting to go. DDoS botnets is the #1 threat against enterprises. I said it before, you can see it here, and they're going after critical industry. It's not just some random enterprise somewhere in some random industry. No, we're talking about healthcare and government, education, manufacturing, utilities. They're going after things that they know hurt. Typically, what we see from these adversaries is they have a government first mentality. When they want to go after a target, they're going to say, how do I go after the government? And oftentimes, governments have the money for defense, right? They have protections in place. They've engaged with vendors like us. They have a solution on-prem. They have it in the cloud. They have whatever it might be. Their websites are under protection. They're using CDNs. There's all kinds of solutions. And most governments would be able to afford that and have that solution in place. Okay, so how do they affect the government without affecting the government? And so the way that this works, typically in non-US countries, most of the time, these critical industries are inexplicit, I can't even talk right now, are very much tied into government, right? So if you think, let's go after a smaller country and their government, their financial organizations, their banks are all tied together. Transportation, logistics, the ports, they're all tied together because that's where they get their primary funds for to fuel the government economy. You have healthcare that's inexplicably tied together. You have education that's in there. All of these things are kind of like stepping stones to get at the government. And so when No Name or RipperSec or Russian Cyber Army team say, I want to go after this government, but man, I can't take any of their websites down. Or if I can, it's some obscure website that nobody really cares about. So let's go after the next thing. Let's go after finance, commercial banking. Let's go after the insurance agencies. Let's go after all of these things that are very, very closely tied, almost inseparable from government. Well, that doesn't work. So let's go after their money. Let's take out the ports. Let's take out logistics companies. Let's go after transportation, air transportation, trains, all of these things. Well, that's not working. Okay, great. Let's go after healthcare. Let's go after where it really hurts for individuals, for people. That's not working. Okay, is there any utility companies that we can go after? Can we in any way impact utilities across the board? And this is what we're seeing. Now, you don't typically see the same thing in the US because everything's pretty much fragmented and separated. You don't have a huge presence of financial organizations that are inherently tied to the government. You have close working relationships, but they're separate entities. That is not true across the rest of the world. And so the adversary knows this, hacktivists know this, and they start walking down the stack. But ultimately, their goal is to impact the government in question that doesn't support their ideology. And that is what we're seeing from these hacktivist groups, particularly No Name, who you can see is the big spike here on the left. There are, okay, when I did this slide, the first half of 2024, there was 287 active DDoS hacktivists working around the world. So I wanted to put together a visual for this. This isn't one group. This isn't a handful of groups. This is hundreds of hacktivists out there launching attacks all the time, always. So this is something that we all have to pay attention to because, I mean, just look at some of these names. There's no regionality to this. There's no specific country to this. This is a global phenomenon. You will see things like Anonymous. They don't care who they target, right? Anonymous goes after everybody. You see No Name 57, you know they go after European organizations. You see Russian Cyber Army team, which basically goes hand in hand. But you also see Executor DDoS. They go after global. They go after US targets. They go after different countries all over the place. LulzSec does the same thing. All of these groups here are contributing to the problem of the DDoS threat landscape. And this is something that we all have to pay attention to. It's not just one group operating anymore. It's not just a handful of them. Probably, if I were to go back 3 or 4 years, it would be very rare for us to see 3 or more hacktivist groups operating at any given time. Now, there might have been more existing, and there might be some sporadic things here and there, but prolific hacktivist groups working together in harmony to launch DDoS attacks, seeing 3 or more of them back then was almost absurd. But then Russia invaded Ukraine, and KillNet happened. And KillNet started to grow and grow, and then they fractured. And then they fractured. And now you have these hundreds of different groups out there that are launching all of these attacks. Then you have some of these groups that say, we're going to go and make coalitions because there's a whole group of us that don't agree with what this country is doing. Let's go back to my South Korea, Romania situation. At the same time, CyberDragon, one of the more prolific groups, formed a South Korea company coalition consisting of them and 40 other hacktivist groups to go after similar targets. And that's just one coalition. There's many of these. There's another one that was called the Holy, I think they called it like the Holy Army, that No Name put together when Spain arrested 2 of the No Name operators. They put together this holy war to go after Spain because they arrested 2 of the No Name operators. And so now you have dozens of these groups working in harmony to go after targets of their choosing. This is what we're seeing all over the place. It's all over different countries. You have your nexus countries, right? You have your main countries that are targeted, but there's countries on here that don't make any sense. Like, why is the Netherlands? Why is Switzerland on here? Why is Denmark on here? So you'll see different countries that like it. I don't understand why these countries are coming under assault. The reality is that adversaries don't need a lot. They need one statement, one. And sometimes they don't even need that. It could be that they know political figures and they know what they stand for. Whether they said anything or not, if they understand their political affiliations, they might just go after you anyway. And so they don't need a lot of justification to go after a particular country, particular enterprise, or industry segment. And it's every network. So this was actually a really interesting finding that we had. We wanted to figure out how often does a brand new network come under assault, and how quickly does it get absconded into an attack harness. And we did this exercise with IoT devices about 4 years ago, where we knew that IoT devices, a brand new one introduced into a network, gets attacked really, really quickly. And what we found then was that within 5 minutes, it's getting brute forced, and within 24 hours, it's getting exploited. We even had a couple of firsthand accounts from our customers that says, oh yeah, we were working in this environment and we were standing up a new ISP, and we deployed these intermittent routers we were using. We had to stand up our own infrastructure, and so we had these routers, and they said within 30 seconds, an adversary had found that router, and then within minutes later, they were actually using it to launch outbound DDoS attacks. Okay? That's like, the delta there is instantaneous, right? There's nothing you can do to prevent that unless you had thought about it beforehand and had deployed countermeasures and fixes in place. And so we did this research to figure out, well, what about networks, whole networks? Do we need to worry about DDoS attacks on day one? Do we have some time to get our DDoS protections in place? Should we have already had that in place before we went live? And what I would say to you is that you should have already had the conversation about DDoS before a network was ever split off from its parent. If you were an upstream service provider carving out smaller ASNs for downstream, or you're carving out an ASN for an enterprise, or you're an enterprise purchasing a new prefix, or you're further subnetting your network. When you spin this thing off, you have 30 days before those start to get abused. And you have 42 days on average before you start to get DDoS attacked. And this is based on 3,100 brand new ASNs introduced in the first half of 2024. In fact, one of these ASNs was actually split off and became a nuisance network. And we saw nearly 200,000 DDoS attacks sourced from that network over the course of 2 months. And so this is something that you absolutely have to think about. This is day one. You should have a DDoS defense plan in place. If you don't, you're not going to be able to succeed in time to be able to counter this. Procurement time, getting all the red line signed, getting all through the red tape, the bureaucracy, getting the funding, that doesn't typically happen within 30 days. And so you need to make sure you're considering that before you ever go live with a brand new network. And so this was a really intriguing finding to me. Now, how do we solve all this? Let's just prepare. Preparation is going to solve most of the problems here. In fact, we say that 80% of all DDoS attacks can be solved with adequate preparation and planning. Because if you have a solution in place, it's going to solve most of the DDoS attacks, which allows you to focus on just the things that are more sophisticated, that are coming from these more prolific DDoS hacktivist groups. That helps because you can narrow your focus, you can narrow the countermeasures, and you don't have to have as many personnel, you don't have to have as much planning ahead of time in terms of which vectors you're going to counter and which countermeasures you're going to employ. You can just deploy something in place, you can get the protection there, and out of the box, many DDoS solutions, ours included, will just solve 80% of the problem. And so that is going to be a huge portion of this. And then from there, it's just a matter of following the incident response cycle. As things come in, make sure you're detecting those, you classify those, you do the trace back to figure out where they came from, how did they get in, where did it come in at the edge, how do I mitigate to there, how did I react to that, and then do a postmortem. But you shouldn't just stop there, right? You shouldn't wait for an incident to happen to go through this process. This should be always ongoing. And that means red teaming, launching simulated attacks against yourself, or going through the motions of what would happen if, and making sure that you're prepared, that you have the knowledge to be able to respond with the countermeasures here. All of that goes hand in hand here. And that's my last slide here. So as I pivot over to my live demo, any questions? I know we're about 5 minutes left, but any questions for me before I go over to my other tab? All right. I don't see anything in chat. So let me just share this. Okay. So what you're seeing here is a little peek inside some of the intelligence that we're capturing. There's two tabs here. The first one here is basically the public perception of these groups. This is, here's all of the public claims to fames by these various groups and who they're going after. And so what I've done here is I've actually limited this to Germany, Netherlands, and Belgium. And so you can look here and you can see that all of these different attacks, you can see that actually, interestingly enough, we don't see these two groups a lot, but they're actually responsible for going after more websites than some of these other groups, like No Name, for instance. And you can see the websites across the bottom. And I actually don't have any problems sharing this with you guys. This is, if you were very involved in this space and you spent a lot of time aggregating this, you could actually go find all of this stuff yourself by looking in Telegram, joining these channels. I don't encourage you to do that. Just don't. There's a lot of weird stuff that happens in Telegram, but you could technically get this yourself. So I have no problem exporting these spreadsheets here and sending those on for you guys to go and peruse. But this is from January 1st of this year to present day. And so you can see here's all of their public claims to fame. You can see that No Name. Belgium, Germany, and Netherlands, they went hard at Belgium. Those 153, almost exclusively during the weekend of your elections. So they were very, very busy during that time period. Germany, this is going to be a lot of the attacks against the German police force. And these are distinct attacks, by the way, not the total number of attacks. So 153 different campaigns, 111 campaigns, and then 29 campaigns. And then I also keep track of the industry. So again, government first. The first two segments are government, transportation, and then finance. And so these are, again, walking that stack here in dominoes, trying to impact the government. And then the rest of these are just kind of a smattering of various other things. Now, when I actually look at the individual attack methodology, and I need to remove some of these here. So what I have done here is I've filtered based on the TLDR. So .be for Belgium, .nl for Netherlands, and .de for Germany. We don't do the same enrichments here with countries, so I can't look it up that way. But you can see all of the different websites that have been targeted Now, this is behind the scenes. This is looking at the iceberg under the water. And this is all of the websites in the actual attack configuration campaigns instructed by no name to their DDoS or botnet. And so you can see a little bit more detail. This May here, there you go. There's your German police. And so you can see, like, of all, like, everything this year so far, May still stands out as the most extreme in terms of the campaign against the German police force. But I mean, this is a lot of activity here in October. And this graph, for some reason, doesn't go to November, but we do have all the way up to November 13th as well. And so I can get into the attack types. I know that TCP SYN flooding, TCP ACT flooding are two of the most prolific types of attacks that they use. Well, guess what? We know how to mitigate those. We know countermeasures for those. But I can also see that HTTP, HTTP2, and HTTP3 are almost 50% of all attacks. Oh, by the way, I can tell that they're post requests, they're get requests. And now I can start to figure out, okay, how do I counter that? What's the countermeasure that solves that issue? And now, understanding the adversary, understanding their attack types, their methodology, we can craft specific responses to this activity. So while I can't take down their botnet, I can't take down all the infrastructure, I can't arrest the thousands of users operating this, I can, in fact, set myself up for success by ensuring that I can counter all of their methodology. Again, just another view of looking at this. You can see port 443, primarily going after websites that are using SSL or some type of security. So timeline here, you can see the attack vectors and types that they're using. TCP is the predominant one, followed by the HTTP stuff. So, okay, that was the quick walkthrough and demo. Like I said, I don't have a problem sharing some of these spreadsheets with you guys. So I can export these. I will probably get these to Danny and maybe Christoph, who can distribute it from there. But hopefully this helps you guys. Hopefully it helps you understand what the adversary is doing, these hacktivist groups, how they're targeting you, and then ultimately from a global perspective, how it impacts the world. So that's what I've got. So I'm gonna hand it back to Christoph. And then if anybody has questions, feel free to ask those now.
Thank you, Richard. Very good presentation. And indeed, we will share recording and your slides. We'll be happy to receive a question if there are any. If not, I would wish Richard a good recovery of his voice. Hope you don't have much to do in that department still today. And then thank you all for joining session.
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, Richard. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.